I mean, architects were just aware of this. There's never any great kind of lectures given or talks or whatever. I think Matthew came over and spoke once. I mean, the whole thing was really just a very, very modest, although it looks very thick and all this sort of thing. The actual sort of stuff was classified as academic rather than technocratic. So in the case of Newton Abbey was a suburb of Belfast, and sporting facilities were being mooted, and he said there should be a sports hall, a sports facility in Newton Abbey, 2 squash courts and a badminton court for a conurbation in excess of 100,000 euro. And this was absolutely laughed at, and this really sort of colours a lot of the rest of the plan. And all he did, in my opinion, was to put the stop line on.
That's all I knew about.
He put the stop line on, and the stop line was the one that we could use in court and say, well, Matthew said stop.
I just think, looking back, that architecture was overwhelmed by other factors and influenced by greater factors than the master plan. And I don't remember anything about the master plan or any impact it had.
This whole thing has to be looked upon with a political setup.
Yes.
And there was a serious thought that a new border would be created. Right? We all knew that there was a rumour that the border would be recast round the middle of Lough Neagh and up to Coleraine. And you would get the new university in Coleraine, Belfast of course, and then Craigavon. And that would be the new Northern Ireland. Now it didn't go beyond that, but the developments were in hand. Craigavon came about because they wanted to put Lurgan and join it with Clonau. Geoffrey Copcutt was the chief architect.
Okay, was he not quite famous architect in his own
right? He'd set up Cumbernauld in Scotland.
Infamous in other words.
And he'd put this on the top of a hill, the windiest hill in bloody Scotland. I mean, it is unbelievable. He then came here. At the end of the day, there was a big row because he suddenly realised that he was getting involved with a political mess. And there were people moving out from Belfast down there. I mean, it's very much a political scene, I think.
My impression, graduating around 1970, and shortly after when I worked for Shanks and Leighton, was that there was a lot of post-war catching up, school building, leisure centre, and I mean, Shanks and Leighton or Kennedy Fitzgerald had a wealth of school projects on Craigavon, Tack, Victoria College, Enniskillen, Collegiate.
Well, I had four sketch plans to do in the first 4 months while I was in the office. And all of them built. And it was just, I mean, that sounds like a boast. I'm not really boasting, it's really because you had to move quickly on it, you know. We came up because we were a mixed firm. On the other hand, outside, there was architects who were solely doing Catholic work and others who were doing sort of service work, I mean, public work. And that was a very, very common sort of thing. In 1958, we came here, it was one of those kind of trade receptions in the Valley Park, and we ended up in an architect at the end of Eglantine Avenue. I mean, it's a Catholic firm, if you take it like that, because that's what work they were doing. And the fellow Mike Curran, who was one of the partners, he asked us up for a drink. And we went into the drawing office, and there was these drawing chests. He said, we've got 14 years work ahead of us. I mean, that was the story. That was what was happening. No question about it.
Yes, but there was an overwhelming amount of work, a lot of work, right, irrespective of whether it was Catholic.
Absolutely.
And it was nothing to do with the master plan. It was all I perceived doing post-war catching up. No change in lifestyle, especially starting in the 60s. The clothes for young people, the drink was affordable, and there was big, huge grants for universities, which opened third-level education up to people like me. My parents couldn't afford it. So it was a big, big social change, overwhelming social change, which impacted on architecture and aspirations, etc. during the 60s. And then, of course, in '69, was the Troubles that hit a lot of that in the head. For instance, big insurance funds had actually invested in the city. The Prudential, the Royal Exchange were all here. And as soon as the Troubles hit, that stopped. People have not invested in Northern Ireland because they're not certain about its political and economic future. I know that during the 80s, when I had an office in London, and developers came over to see what was happening in Belfast. You know the Bank of Ireland and Donegal Square South? When the English developer, a client of ours, bought that, he probably sold it in months, because the UDA started rowing up in Shankill Road, all of that. Just hot potatoes. That the work was handed out from who you know and what religion you were, etc. And I couldn't break through that. I was fed up working very hard on criminal work and not making a lot of money, and I knew if I went to London, because it was Thatcher boom time, I would pick up work. But then shortly after that, the whole procurement system changed, right? The EC procurement system forced the Catholic churches to go through at least an interviewing system, which would have been chaired by an independent project manager. So Sunday work became distributed, not whether you were a Catholic firm or a Protestant firm. Joe's practice was doing serious amount of work, schools, leisure centres, etc. As were other practices, like the one you mentioned, 14 years work. That's unheard of. But I tagged on to things like housing association work, because right about 1976, the housing sector started to devolve housing responsibility to housing associations, and there were massive swathes of work throughout the city.
We were offered EIS Street up off the Mountain Road from the Housing Executive, and also the connecting street, and we were given that because of the mixed partnership, for no other bloody reason. I was raging when I heard it. I said, "What? You're not picking us because of our quality. I have to be careful, And when we got up to do the surveys, in EIS Street, the bins hadn't been empty for 7 years. This was during the Trouble now, it was the start of the Trouble. And we managed within 2 weeks to get them all cleared. You see, the two of us had Scottish accents, and we were very glad that we'd done what we'd done, And then somebody thought, because of the Scottish accent, that we were part of the army. We were spies. The trouble is that these are the non-architectural stories that actually they had to be taken into account. We didn't ask any of the staff to go and do that. Jim and I did it ourselves. Survey these houses, because it was
dangerous.
It was dangerous.
Yes.
Divis again was a political sort of, it was awful, but it was based on Sheffield, which is now highly successful. And the blocks, for instance, at the end of the old Hollywood Road, they were condemned because they had walkways and this sort of stuff. It was then closed in, concierge put on, thing worked beautifully. I mean, you've got to put it in context of how these things were, when they were done. It was meant to be a wonderful architectural scheme that had stitched in so many people into this multi-storey building. Yes, absolutely crazy, but it was being done because of the demand for housing.
There was a post-war demand, it's right, the United Kingdom.
Slum clearance had to be done. Voting fodder had to be provided, and that's what all these estates were for.
But in Belfast, an enormous amount of people were displaced from their communities, and I'm thinking of that whole swathe of land that lies between York Street or York Road and the motorway. Well, that was all houses and houses,
awful.
And houses and houses, and even areas called Little Italy, where the Italians lived there, all wiped out and put up into pole glass and places like that.
There are political aspects that really maybe can overwhelm the architectural scene. It's there, and you can't avoid it. Architectural group. That was set up by people who ultimately were all partners in the firms, just been earning, and they joined together to stick a pin up the council and all that sort of thing to make sure that we get things done. They prepared town plans. The Belfast Centre Walk was a book. It was a brochure that was prepared, but they were making ideas, just like what Mark Hackett and Declan's doing now, in a different kind of way. One of the things that might be interesting for the architects of Belfast would have been to have had a qualified school. One of the reasons I'm here was that there was work available here to qualified staff, and there wasn't anybody qualified in Belfast at the time. A proposal was put forward in that issue, and there were guys there who had been in practice for years and had soaked all the work up and all the money and all that sort of thing. And they were saying, oh, that would be terrible competition to most of the members here. And said, no, we can't have that.
The School of Architecture.
Against the School of Architecture. Why modernism's failed? In what way did you think that it would have failed? Housing, multi-storey houses, the use of concrete. It, in some way, was to be taking the place of stone, but they don't bother cleaning concrete. They do clean stone. So what you get is all this concrete stuff that's just left over the years. And any even good buildings are looking terrible. I mean, it's the form of the building, the plan of the building, that's all part of architecture. It's all part of modernism.
Cities aren't designed anymore. The planning office has no design control per se over cities. And as a result, if a site comes up for sale, a developer will pay millions and millions for that site, knowing that he can break the planning guidelines and get tall buildings. And that's been happening in the city. And if you think of the only decent street in Belfast is Royal Avenue and Donegal Place, and that street was designed by prescription, and it's a successful street. If you look at Great Victoria Street as an example, it's a hodgepodge, irrespective of the quality of individual pieces of architecture. It's a complete shambles. It's not been designed. And I've been a long-term advocate of that. You need to design your spaces. And the buildings that are inserted to make those spaces need to follow certain rules in terms of architectural language, height, scale, etc., towards making a good place. And you mentioned the roads in investing. They have caused the greatest disarray, far greater than the IRA. If you look at Dunbar Link, that just as a fill tip line from one point to another, knock all the buildings down, leave wasteland on the other side, ruin the urban green. There's a sudden realisation that we have messed up our cities. And it's not to do with individual architects, it's to do with those who control our cities, the planning authorities. Have messed it up.
There's a technical problem that came about. When we were doing Dial House, there was a planned ratio to the height to the plan. That has now all gone. There is no criteria considered. I mean, in those days you would have said there was a 3-to-1 ratio, do you remember?
Yes, that's right, yes.
So there was three times the plan would be the height. But it meant there was a control that they could actually, the architect could look to and say, well, that's what it is. And we set back Dial House. Well, that was because we thought that if we were coming up like this in every street, up to 6, 7 and 8 floors, it'd be like New York eventually. You know? You would be trying to get not necessarily what they wanted, but what we thought they should aspire to. And that to me is what the architect's role is.
Yes.
The design of the building should be what your interpretation of your client's brief is and what they would aspire to. Now that might be arrogant, but it's not as arrogant as determinism. If they want something so bad, go somewhere else.
Frank Lloyd famously said, you don't give the client what he wants, but what he thinks he wants.
Yes.
What he really wants all the time.
That's an arrogant way of saying it. He was arrogant, I mean, let's face it. He's a genius. Geniuses can do anything, like Frank Lloyd Wright. They can do anything. The rest of us just have to get on.
I'll tell you an interesting thing. I was judge for the AIA Award in 2001, and I was judge in panel with Roshan Hennigan and an architect from Norway, and O'Donnell Shumey won the award for the Factory at Letter Fact, and they invited me down to hand out this Downs medal and to make a speech. I had no idea what to say, but I sort of thought about things. At that time, Republic of Ireland was booming. Not only was it booming, but they were producing extremely good pieces of architecture. At the same time, we were starting to get work in Dublin, and they were all urging for good architecture. We weren't producing anything at that time. in Northern Ireland as good. And when you looked at the Republic of Ireland, they had all the ingredients for good architecture across the board, coming out of states where people have a very, very strong sense of their own national identity, where there's wealth and where there is high esteem. They were definitely Irish.
That's a very good point.
They were definitely European. They were definitely wealthy, and they had leadership. In the north, we didn't know whether we were Irish, English, British. No leadership, and we had no money. And that drives aspirations down, especially from clans. As Richard Rogers once said, the cultic architecture is commensurate with the enlightenment of the clan. And he's quite right about that. Look at the Lloyd's building. They needed to accept something really, really radical, and they did. And as a result, we have an outstanding building. You don't get that here.